Hey everybody, this little video, excuse me, is entitled Vietnam Basics because it's kind of the basic background we need. We'll use a lot more primary sources, pictures, images. Our interviews we'll do as a way to look deeper into the Vietnam conflict. Understand your notes are just your basic background. I would love for y'all to come in with ready to go. So these are going to be due on Thursday, May 15. May 14. Excuse me. Please make sure they're ready for that day. Same day we'll see the Vietnam vets in class. I was saying that Gulf Tongue resolution that we looked at in class on Tuesday, passed in 1964, gave LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the power to deploy troops to Vietnam. It was not a declaration of war. Congress just said, LBJ, you can do it, but it's not an actual declaration of war. Please understand, by 1964, the NVA, so North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong, did control most of South Vietnam. Kennedy, when he was in charge yet, before the Diem assassination, had about 16,000 troops in Vietnam as advisors, helping out South Vietnamese military. When LBJ gets in charge after the assassination and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution happens in 64, things escalate greatly, okay? In 1965, the first large-scale bombing start, where there's a large-scale bombing of North Vietnam. After that, the first large-scale combat troops are sent to Vietnam by 1965. 1965, there's maybe talking 116 or so odd thousand troops in Vietnam. By 1968, there's 500,000 U.S. troops in Vietnam. So it's going to expand huge during this time. Look at the two sides real quick, okay? On one side, you have the U.S., you have South Vietnam, you have Hmong soldiers from Laos and other allies that are with us, that are with the United States on one side. On the other side, you have the North Vietnam, also called the Viet Minh or NVA. All three ways we used, okay? They are the uniformed soldiers of North Vietnam. They were their own army, wore the uniforms, all that kind of stuff. You also had the Viet Cong, who were the peasants by day, fighters by night. Could be men, women, children, could honest to God be anybody. And so there's really one of the things that people didn't know was who you were fighting. The person you're waving to one day could be the person trying to kill you that night. And so please understand that made things very difficult. You're not really sure who you're fighting. A Vietnam vet who came and talked to one of my class said that he was stabbed by a 9-year-old kid. 9-year-old kid was part of the Viet Cong, and he was on leave in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam at the time, and he was stabbed by a 9-year-old kid because that was just part of the conflict. So anybody could be opposition. The fighting, understand this war was very, very different from World War II or even Korea. The NVA, the North Vietnamese soldiers right down here, they had a huge advantage, all right? They knew the terrain. They knew where they're going. Vietnam has a lot of mountains, a lot of jungle, and they knew how to get there. There were tunnels built into the sides in the jungle. Could literally appear from anywhere, boom, just like that. And so they knew the terrain. They were able to fight in the humidity and the heat and the rain of the jungle. They knew how to get around that. On the flip side, the Viet Cong, they also knew how to fight. They fought what's called a guerrilla war. Guerrilla war here, that means a war without like formal uniforms and was basically fought by regular people, kind of like the United States did during the Revolutionary War, using things like booby traps. Booby traps could be IEDs, like grenades and shells that are meant to go off as people are walking with tripwires, that kind of thing. There are punji sticks, which was taking bamboo, and you cut it at an angle, and you cover it with, could be feces or animal manure or whatever, and you put them in the ground, and you put a grass mat on top of it, and you would step through the mat and step on the punji stick and hurt your feet. There were spikes that would swing through the jungle, like big spike-type balls, those kind of things that would hit and kill people. Sneak attacks and snipers. Middle of the night walking, all of a sudden, the whole area is just lit up with fire, that kind of stuff. Bombs and tunnels, those kind of things. I mean, it was definitely a war that was different. It could happen anywhere, anytime, anybody could be the enemy. And that was why the war was not really going well for the United States to start off. Now, the U.S. was led by this guy here, General William Westmoreland, 4-star general, and he had two things he had to do, okay? One was stop losing the war, because it wasn't working, okay? Two was search and destroy the guerrillas of Viet Cong and other forces and get rid of them. So basically, that's the mission: search and destroy. Now, U.S. soldiers had to do with a very, very different climate. This is a very hot, humid climate. Vietnam is a gorgeous, beautiful country. Okay, beautiful, beautiful country, amazing look at. We'll see this when we look at some of the video stuff in class. It was very hot, very humid, very steamy, a lot of bugs and insects, some poisonous animals and snakes. You're in the jungle pretty much. And it's very, very different than the U.S. And with that terrain, Envy knew the terrain, the jungle has that very, very dense jungleness to it, and people knew how to hide in there. Story about animals, though. A Vietnam vet that talked to my class when I taught in Green Bay, he told a story about how he went to sleep one night in the jungle on patrol, and he woke up to a tiger licking his face. A big tiger was licking, as he was sweating, was licking the salt from his face. So that's kind of stuff that U.S. soldiers are dealing with, they never had to deal with before. Now, the idea here was that we would be done with the war in 12 to 18 months. He says a year from now, 1966, May 1967, the latest, we are going to be out of the conflict, out of the war, we'll be back home. Now, big thing that helped the United States, too, is technology, okay? One of the first things we see being used in this war is helicopters in mass usage, okay? Where they could drop off soldiers anywhere, pick soldiers up for the search and destroy missions. You didn't have to have a front line to use helicopters. And using helicopters, you can drop off a small group of soldiers, fight anywhere within a certain radius, and come back to the landing zone and pick them back up. You also had the idea of carpet bombing. B-52s were giant airplanes designed to drop nuclear bombs. Well, we're not doing nuclear bombs, so instead of dropping tons at a time of regular bombs, creating these huge carpet bombing areas where you're basically picking an area and just bomb everything in it to kill everything off. A lot of times what they would do is they would start a firefight would start, and soldiers on the ground would call in airstrikes from planes, B-52s, whatever, to bomb areas and work that. Because of the foliage, we use a lot of chemical technology to take care of the jungle. So they used what's called Agent Orange as a way to kill all the leaves off the tree. Like you see this bottom picture right here. That Agent Orange was supposed to get rid of all the leaves on the trees. It's a defoliant, which then made it easier to see people and not hide as easy to hide in the desert in the jungle. Now, downstate Agent Orange, that later on it was found to cause cancer. A lot of vets have gotten very, very sick and died because of Agent Orange. My dad had a buddy who served in Vietnam. They said they would use the Agent Orange to wash their hands off, grease off their hands to working on helicopters. He later got cancer due to the use of Agent Orange. Napalm was also something they used. Napalm was a firebomb. It was basically jelly gasoline. And you would use napalm to burn an area, whether it be the forest or the jungle, whatever. Now, a lot of people talk about the draft as being part of the Army. Just understand where this looks at here, okay? In terms of how many soldiers in the United States serve in Southeast Asia, the grand number is about 3.4 million soldiers serve in Vietnam or Southeast Asia between 65 and 73. The biggest number is just over 500,000 when they're in country in 1968. Understand that only 1/4 of that number were drafted. A lot of people are volunteer, okay? On the flip side of that, World War II, about 68% were drafted in World War II. Also, what makes Vietnam very, very different is the age of the soldier. Most soldiers in Vietnam were between 19 and 22 years old. In some cases, they couldn't even vote yet because voting age at the time was 21. In World War II, the average fighting age was 26. The kids, and I'm going to say this, the kids going to Vietnam were a lot younger than the people who fought in World War II. People also look at the classes and the social class background. About 3/4 of all Vietnam soldiers were from lower middle class backgrounds. The Army was a choice. You couldn't find a job, join the Army. As it was a steady paycheck, especially with combat pay, those kind of things at the time, and it was an option for work. Very risky work, obviously, but an option for work. Draft-wise, and we'll talk about that in a second, why people are happy with the draft, a lot of people that were drafted from lower classes too. About 80% of all fighters in Vietnam had a high school diploma from the United States. And so it was still a pretty well-educated fighting force we had. The biggest comparison I have of this time period, guys, is combat time. The average World War II soldier, out of 365 days, okay, saw 60 days of combat per year. Okay? Now in Vietnam, your hitch in Vietnam was 1 year in country. You served one tour was 1 year. That's how long a tour was. In that 1 year, the average Vietnam soldier saw 240 days of combat. And I think, why is that such a big deal? Well, in World War II, you had regular battle lines, and battles happened, in certain spurts. In Vietnam, you had patrols, you had the idea of helicopter to be able to drop anybody anywhere at any time. You're fighting for almost 2/3 of the year. That if you were in country for one tour, 365 days, you might be fighting for almost 2/3 of that, and really added to the stress, and anxiety of Vietnam. Now, draft-wise, just to record that draft-wise, is automatic register for the draft still is that today. Gentlemen, when you turn 18, you must register with Selective Service, and if there ever would be a draft in the future, you could be called. Now, draft exemptions were big, okay? If you were in college, you didn't have to go, okay? If you were what's called a conscience objector, you objected to the war, you were a pacifist, you had some other religious or issue that said you couldn't fight, you have to go. If you were considered unfit for duty, either physically or psychologically, you couldn't have to go. My father was 4F'd. That meant he was unfit for duty. He had a knee injury, couldn't go. People I know that they may have broken their leg, waited for the leg to heal, went to Vietnam. Hurt a knee playing football, let the knee heal, checked out again, go to Vietnam. We'll talk about that, and we'll kind of see that as we're going to look at it in class as well. As of 1969, there's what's called a draft lottery. Every single person was given a number corresponding to the day you were born. You wanted a high number. They started 1, 2, 3, 4, and went on from there. My dad's number was called 1969, actually. My father's number was called. He had to drive down to Milwaukee from Shawnee, where he grew up, and be taken into a building for his physical, where he was 4F'd. He said the first thing he saw was this guy running out and 3 military police chasing after him and dragging the guy back in, kicking and screaming. My dad hadn't left Shawnee very much. He was like, wow, what's going on here? So there's some questions with the draft, especially that, if you were in college or other kind of thing you got out of, you could have to go. That a lot of times the upper class who were in college weren't drafted. And so a lot of times those lower class people that are middle class that were not going to college had to answer the call for the draft, and that kind of caused some animosity in the country, especially in terms of racial type things. Whereas 1/10 of soldiers in the war were African American, about 8%, 8% of those had casualties. But it was that question about the poorer classes being drafted to go fight in Vietnam. Now, this is my last slide for this part here, guys. But by 1968, we'll pick up 1968 for our next note set assigned on Thursday. There's no way to tell who was winning this war, okay? Early on, there's no ground to really claim. The only thing they really looked at was who killed more people. And actually, every single night on TV, or every week on TV, there was a casualty count. How many U.S. soldiers have been killed or wounded, how many Vietnamese have been killed or wounded, so on and so forth. The war is essentially happening live on TV. Every night there was a scene from Vietnam, basically. Essentially, at this point, both sides are trying to wear the other side down. Who can lose more people and have to leave first? And as we're going to leave this, we'll look at some videos and stuff in class tomorrow on a Wednesday and Thursday. Thursday will be with the Vietnam vets as well. Please make sure your notes are done for that, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. We'll see y'all in class.